So let's proceed to the setting or the second element of the short story, which is the setting. Now, what is meant of setting? When we say setting, it's the place and time in the story. The setting is the location of the action. An author should describe the environment or surroundings of the story in such detail that the reader feels that he or she can picture the scene. Unusual settings such as fantasy world can be interesting, but everyday setting can help a reader to better visualize the story and feel connected with the plot. All right, now let's proceed to the next element of the short story. Let's have the third one, which is the plot. Now, when we say plot, it's the series of events in the story. So the plot is the main sequence of events that make up the story. In short stories, the plot is usually centered around one experience or significant moment. Consider the following questions when you are identifying or the plot of the story. First, what is the most important event? Second, how is the plot structured? Third, is it linear, chronological, or does it move around? Is the plot believable? So those are somehow questions that would help you elicit the plot in the short story. So there are different parts of plot. Now we have the first one, which is the beginning or the exposition. Second, the rising action. Third, the middle or the climax. Fourth is the falling action. And the fifth one is the ending or the resolution. So try to observe the diagram, right? So as you can see, try to observe the diagram. First one is beginning, second rising action, third the climax, fourth is the falling action, and the third one is the and the last one is the resolution. Now let's discuss further each part of this plot. Now let's have the first one. So the first one is the exposition. Now what do you think happens in the exposition? Anyone from the class? Anyone? Any idea? What do you think happens here or happens here?
Introduction of characters, sir.
Okay, so the introduction of the characters, you're correct with that one. Now, in exposition, this usually occurs at the beginning of a short story. Here, the characters are introduced. So, characters are introduced. We also learn about the setting of the story. So, in the exposition, the setting is also being introduced in the story. Most importantly, we are introduced to the main conflict or the main problem. So that's still under the exposition. Now, you mentioned a while ago that exposition somehow introducing the characters at the same time the setting of the story. Now, how about the rising action? Anyone from the class? What is meant of rising action? Any idea? Any idea of the rising action? One of your classmates mentioned a
Rising
while.
action
Mhm. Includes what? Who was it? Raise your hand.
includes all decisions, character.
Okay, includes decision and all the characteristics, right, of the characters. Now let's discuss further the rising action. So we mentioned a while ago that the exposition introduces the character, right? Meanwhile, in this part of the rising action, this part of the story begins to develop the conflict, okay, or the conflicts of the story. A building of interest or suspense occurs at the lead to the climax or leads to the climax. Complication arises in the rising action. Okay? Okay? Are we good with that? All right, so
Can you
let's
repeat?
repeat. Okay, so we mentioned a while ago that the exposition is the introduction of the characters. Meanwhile, in the rising action, this part of the story begins to develop the conflict. Okay, the conflict is being introduced in the rising action. A building of interest or suspense occurs and lead to the climax. Meaning to say, in the rising action, complications arise, right? A lot of complications arises in this rising action. Is it clear to everyone? Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
let's proceed to the next part of plot, which is the climax. So we mentioned a while ago that okay, questions? All right, so climax. What is meant of climax, anyone from the class?
It's the
The
most
time,
interesting part of
Please,
the
the
story.
climax.
Okay, the most interesting part or the turning point of the story. You're correct with that one. That the climax is the turning point of the story. Usually, the main character comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way. This is the most intense moment of the story, right? The highest peak or the turning point of the story. Now let's proceed to the next part, which is the resolution. So we mentioned a while ago that exposition is the beginning of the story. Rising action introducing the conflict. Climax is the turning point, and falling action is somehow solving the problems out from the story. Now when we say resolution, resolution is the conclusion, okay? All loose ends are tied up, meaning to say it's where the problem is being solved. Either the character defeats the problem, learns to live with the problem, or the problem defeats the character. So that is meant of resolution. Not all stories, okay, not all stories somehow you can say that it's already the ending part of the resolution. It's because, like, for example, if it's a novel, if there are in the resolution part, they also introduce new characters, meaning to say it's not yet the end of the story because there's another chapter of the story. So meaning to say it is not the resolution yet. If there are characters being introduced in the resolution part, meaning to say it's still the exposition. It's like going back to the exposition. Is it clear? Not all stories will end up already. Perhaps, like for example, if there are novels or in novels, there are different chapters. First novel, they already have the resolution. They already have the resolution. However, there are characters being introduced, right? So meaning to say it's not yet the end of the story. They'll go back to the exposition. Is it clear to everyone? Is it clear? Questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you still see me? Wait, no. How about that? Can you still see me?
No, sir.
Yes, sir.
No.
How about that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now let's proceed to putting it all together. So as I just mentioned a while ago, exposition is the beginning of the story. The rising action is the beginning of the story. When you say climax, it's the middle of the story. It's the rising point or the highest point of the story. Then we also have the falling action or the resolution. It's the ending of the story. Now this time, let's move on to this question. The climax is the most
Launch
exciting.
control, this is Houston. We are go for launch.
So the climax is the most exciting part of the story. Why do you think it's the most exciting part of the story? Anyone from the class? Again, anyone from the class can give me the answer. Why do you think that the climax is the most exciting part of the story? Let's have Ishi. Ishi?
because
Mhm.
because this is where the conflicts are being revealed, and
Mhm.
that's what makes the story exciting.
Okay, that's great. It's the most exciting part. It's because the conflict is being revealed out from the story. So we only have few minutes here. So I'll be sending another link for our class. We only have 5 minutes, so I'll be sending another link for the continuation of our class. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's great.